Well, I hope you're still enjoying this book. I know I am. I mean, I haven't, my focus really wasn't on early Christian history, especially, church history. Uh, though I studied it in seminary and a little bit in graduate school, but it's a really nice refresher going over some of these things and putting everything in place. And I think the one thing that has been most enlightening to me is if I'm following Fredrickson's thesis, and I think I am, she's really dispelling us of this illusion that the whole time between, the writing of Paul's letters and the founding of the Christian Empire with Constantine, roughly about 250 years or so, she's dispelling the illusion that that time was just filled with nothing but persecutions, that Christians were on the run, that Romans were, hunting them down, and they were seen as the uh, kind of the bad people, the bad boys, the enemies of the state. And really, what she's established is that there were pockets of persecution. The first one being that of Nero. Nero, roughly about the time between 60 and 70, if I've got my emperors in my head correctly, but roughly about the time that Peter and Paul, the apostles, were said to have been executed. But Nero needed a scapegoat for what many believe to be his burning of Rome. Uh, he wanted to, as many civic leaders do, they try to get rid of the old slums and establish a new economic development area, and that's what Nero was doing in Rome. And the one thing that was standing in the way of his architectural interests was the slums where a lot of Christians lived, or the low rent district where a lot of Christians. So that was burned down, and the story about Nero fiddling during the burning of Rome. But after Nero, things were kind of sporadic after that, according to Fredrickson. Now, what I find interesting though is, when we read the Book of Revelation, our target date for that was somewhere around 100 of the Common Era. And were you to read that alone, you would think that Christians were completely, set upon by the powers that be. But Fredrickson, unless I missed it, and I'll ask all of you intellectuals with your, careful reading to find out, Fredrickson seems to pass over that time period, which I find kind of curious. So either A, it was a highly localized type. In the Book of Revelation, the persecution that was going on was highly localized and not, and very specific to John of Patmos. Or B, it didn't happen at all. It's probably A was the is the best answer to that. Any thoughts on that? Did that strike anybody when reading it? Because we spent a good amount of time on the Book of Revelation, and we were given to think that things were pretty rushed. But remember, we're talking about seven churches in Asia where that John was writing to. But the persecutions that we're talking about here really began around 250 of the Common Era under Decius and then Valerian and then the emperors, then finally Diocletian, whose persecutions were the worst. Um, but during this time, there is a literature that starts to develop that really lionizes those who were being persecuted and those who were being executed. And the stories that were told, these so-called spectacles of death, of the martyrs, the witnesses, The stories that we're told seem to follow the pattern that was established in, uh, well, during the intertestamental period around the third and second century BCE, when the book of Second Maccabees was written. It was the Jews who were being persecuted and martyred by the Syrians/Greeks. Um, and these terrible stories of how they are flayed and all the violent things that happened to them at the time. Christians kind of pick up on that model and start to tell these stories, and they become what Fredrickson calls communal performances of memory. Not that there was any, we're not hearing historical accounts of things that happened. Not that there wasn't some persecution, but they are highly stylized and they are highly elaborated to serve a particular purpose. And that's the question that Fredrickson's asking. We can't really determine whether these persecutions were widespread. I mean, most likely they were not. So then why this literature? Why did it develop? Why is it that, around the middle of the third century, we start to see people um, developing what might be called a cult of the saints, a cult of the saints that still persists to this day in the Roman Catholic Church. It was something that, of course, that the reformers wanted to do away with. But the saints were, in this time period, were almost invariably martyrs that were martyrs for the faith. And by the end of the fourth century, excuse me, yeah, by the end of the fourth century, they come to have intercessory powers. So pray for us, Mother Mary, pray for us, Saint Peter, pray for us, Saint Michael, all of those things. And so what Fredrickson is doing is giving us a understanding of how those things developed. Um, and in the midst of this, there is almost a catechetical, catechism that's being offered in that, the quintessential uh, identity for Christians is established on persecution. That you're doing it right if you're being persecuted. And this is where we left off last time. Um, Saint Sebastian here, which I think I told you last time is a patron saint of associate deans who are getting it from all sides. I actually gave this photograph to a couple of my colleagues. Upon my retirement, I hope they have it in their hang it in their office because it's pretty much represents our job. But when we left last time, we read this quote from Paula Fredrickson. She's interested not so much in the historical acts, historical phenomenon of martyrdom, but in the literature that develops around it. Martyr acts as literature were communal performances of memory. They were read aloud in commemoration of the martyr's death. They did ideological work. In other words, they they tried to teach dogma in many ways. They tried to teach the Christians who were relatively new Christians what it meant to be Christian, right? They did ideological work, both constructing and presenting idealized exempla of Christian identity. Again and again in these stories, the hero insists, I am a Christian. And that's a trope that you hear throughout these. I read some of them this weekend, and it's the same story with the same language that's being used. I am a Christian, and therefore I can't do this. I am a Christian. So it's one of those kind of mantras that you're going to see in each of these stories. These writings represent less a report of actual events than narrative teaching devices, articulating a social identity that created a neat and unambiguous distinction between pagan and Christian. They also provided a way to understand persecution as the quintessential Christian experience, one literally embodied in Jesus. Um, so stories that are being used in the church. I don't want to say fabricated, but elaborated. Uh, and let's assume that there were, these historical events that took place, but they provide the springboard to teach Christians in the church how to be Christian. And what better way to do it than to offer an alternative to one of the things that was drawing Christians away from the church? And that, boy, when I read this, especially in the Roman Empire, by the third century, uh, Rome was having a hard time, holding everything together. The senators, the people who are aristocrats, they were forcing the peasants off of their farmland and bringing them into the cities. And so you had people, notice how similar this is to us today. You had aristocrats who owned wide, swaths of land, thousands upon thousands of acres, and more people coming into the cities, right? And then you had so many people in the cities, you had to figure out how to take care of them lest they begin to revolt. And the one way they will revolt is A, they don't have enough food, and B, they don't have enough to do. Then you got problems because people can sit around and, think about the uh, how profoundly they have had the wool pulled over their eyes. So what the Romans decide is these are really simple people. Let's give them civic displays of entertainment. Let's send some of our war criminals and our war prisoners into the Colosseum, and the people can watch them get eaten up by lions, and the people can watch gladiatorial violence, and it becomes a manipulative tool throughout the Roman Empire to keep the people appeased. Um, when I think of this, I cannot help but think of the way that mixed martial arts fighting. Do you all know about this? It's about as gladiatorial as you can get. Basically, these guys just get into this round ring and beat the hell out of each other until one of them is completely unconscious. What did Donald Trump do shortly after he won his election? He went to an mixed martial arts, MMA fight, right? And he's been there a couple times since that. Um, First of all, kind of representing, his very masculine, toxic masculine identity, but then, you know, uh, being among the people whose eyes have had the wool pulled over them. Frankly, he's just performing more bread and circus, or our aristocrats, so to speak, our Roman senators who have bought up all the land and all of the capital, are using this as bread and circus. I mean, the more things change, it might be kind of a obvious thing, but it really burns me up, especially if you know history. Anybody, any thoughts on that? Denny
Don't get
usually.
me started on the Department of Education director.
Well, oh, exactly. Who is who is whom, right? Yeah, the wife of the guy who does whatever his big time wrestling at, or World Federation Wrestling, right?
Yes.
Vince McMahon. Yeah. Um, One who, has perpetuated bread and circus his whole life. So any other, I'm sorry, I'm getting into a diatribe here. Go ahead, Denny.
Uh, Dan, I am impressed at how few Americans, I think, really tune into these blood sports. That's my impression. Maybe I'm, you know, missing the point here, or missing the data. But
Mm. Well, I know if you go into a sports bar in the off football season, there's usually two or three televisions that got this have this MMFA. Uh, I don't know how many Americans do it. I find it really difficult to watch, but apparently there is enough bloodlust that it's making money for people across the country. Uh, What's your impression, Denny, as to why you think not many are watching it?
I think they're too busy with, spending their money and, on credit, or using their credit card, I should say.
Yeah.
Seriously,
Mhm.
there just there are too many other options out there that, um, they have been taught very carefully in their families, are more appropriate, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Um,
I think
I don't know.
Dan, I think football, it's interesting, rugby has really never taken off here like it did, I think, in England. So
Yeah.
I think football comes maybe as close to a mass spectator equivalent of what you're talking about, which is
Yeah.
that's pretty pretty mundane, pretty civilized, and especially if you look at the way in which Trump will not, the way in which the teams treat each other at the end of the game, with great civility, usually, and hugs, and see you next time, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of connection between uh kind of the Roman civic religio, the religion, and our civic religion, which is football. And the one thing that I think is so interesting is that usually at the beginning of the year, the very first game, there is some sort of blood sacrifice that's offered up to the football gods. Usually, the team Nebraska will play like Central Carolina tech school or something like that, and just obliterate them, right? You know, and if they don't obliterate them, oh my gosh, the gods have turned their backs, and of course it's going to be a terrible season. But it is an initial blood offering. It really, it really is. Anyway, why are we why are we talking about this? Because these gladiatorial spectacles were the things that were drawing Christians away from the church. So much so that, what the church fathers, Tertullian, wrote a whole treatise, wrote a whole letter on spectacle, on why, Christians should not be drawn to this. So what do you do in that kind of situation? Well, you provide your own spectacle in the narrative. And then this is the context, in which a lot of these martyrdom stories developed. Christians can hear these stories, and as several things are going on. A, they're given an example of how it is to how they should live. B, in the story, there are certain kind of dogmatic aspects to the faith that are communicated. And C, they have the entertainment value of the bloodlust, right, that they normally would have gotten in the Colosseum. And these martyrs end up being kind of like athletes for Christ. They take on this persona. And I had to give you just a snippet of one of these stories. The story of Perpetua and Felicity, a young Roman woman who has just had a child, and then her slave, a African slave by the name of Felicity, they refuse to sacrifice to the emperor, and they're sent off to jail. And the whole story is about their time in jail until eventually, they have to go out into the Colosseum. They have to go out and to be, thrown to the lions. And usually this is the place where all of these um, uh, gladiatorial, gladiator-like events happen. So I wanted to read this to you, and I hope you'll indulge me. But if you look at a text called the Acts of the Christian Martyrs, there's stories again and again like this, over and over and over. So this is Perpetua speaking, right? She is being led out into the Colosseum area. I looked at the enormous crowd who watched in astonishment. I was surprised that no beasts were let loose on me, for I knew that I was condemned to die by the beasts. Then out came an Egyptian against me, of vicious appearance, together with his seconds, guys that help him out, right? not in the fighting, but just kind of help him. Here's your sword, that kind of thing. Together with his seconds to fight with me. There also came up to me some handsome young men to be my seconds and assistants. So you've got, the two champions with their assistants. My clothes were stripped off, and suddenly I was a man. Interesting. My seconds began to rub me down with oil, as they are wont to do before a contest. Then I saw the Egyptian on the other side rolling in the dust. Like look at some horse or something. Next, there came forth a man of marvelous stature, such that he rose above the top of the amphitheater. He was clad in a beltless purple tunic with two stripes, one on either side, running down the middle of his chest. He wore sandals that were wondrously made of gold and silver, and he carried a wand like an athletic trainer, and a green branch on which there were golden apples. This is the prize for the winter, right? And he asked for silence and said, if this Egyptian defeats her, he will slay her with the sword. But if she defeats him, she will receive this branch. Then he, the purple guy, withdrew. We drew close to one another and began to let our fists fly. This Perpetua, the woman, now become a man, and this Egyptian who is all, decked out and began to let our fists fly. My opponent tried to get hold of my feet, but I kept striking him in the face with the heels of my feet. Then I was raised up into the air and I began to pummel him without, as it were, touching the ground. Then, when I noticed there was a lull, I put my two hands together, linking the fingers of one hand with those of the other, and thus I got a hold of his head. He fell flat on his face, and I stepped on his head. I mean, this is the kind of MMA stuff that we got. You put them in the sleeper hold and get them down, and you're victorious over them. But over and over and over, these stories are being told in the so-called Acts of the Christian Martyrs that were later collected as the Acts of the Christian Martyrs. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Dan, I have a question. So were these stories coordinated? Did someone decide this is what we need to tell the people? Were they organic? I just,
I
it,
Were they coordinated by a central bishop?
yeah,
I doubt
bishop or
I doubt that, but we know that Tertullian saw the danger. Tertullian, who was he was in North Africa, and I can't remember, Carthage maybe, but he saw the danger of his church people being pulled away. Uh, so it's not like the churches are all getting together in councils at this point, because remember, we're talking about many Christianities. There's really no central authority. You have a lot of different perspectives on what it means to be Christian. But one of the ways that you develop a sense of what it means to be Christian is by, uh, if I'm understanding Fredrickson correctly, by creating this kind of teaching tool. It became a teaching tool that provided an alternative to the Colosseum. It provides all the blood and guts, and it provides an introduction to Christian dogma. But we can't really think of the church as being in any way centralized at this point. We're looking at about 250 of the Common Era. There are, as Fredrickson says, many Christianities out there. But it's interesting. And I don't know how better to answer the question, Harvey. Do you want to respond to that?
I just, it makes you wonder, was there quote unquote a propaganda machine saying, okay, we've got to counter this, and this is an approach we can take, or did, a few bishops or clergy
Yeah,
just say, we can tell the story this way because the flock will understand it, or don't
yeah.
know. Just
Well, most likely Tertullian's on spectacle was, kind of a clarion call for that kind of thing. But it's really hard to say. I'm now, don't get me wrong, there were bishops, right? And there were leaders, and I'm sure they were having conversations about this kind of thing, but any kind of centralized authority is not really yet established, at least not the way that it would be eventually. Any other thoughts on this?
Well, Dan, I think that she makes a point that somewhere that you know, we can acknowledge that these sorts of entertainments happened where, they put as you said, the people in the Colosseum with the lions and all of that. And, people went to that. And if you were gambling, as people have an inclination to do, put it this way, the lion is usually the favorite. Okay. So the lion is usually the favorite, but the lion doesn't always win. And it goes back even to, I think she referenced the book of Daniel.
Right.
And so
Right.
you have the same kind of thing here, which I think is maybe a message of faith that,
Yeah.
We have had our martyrs, but the martyrs are the noble people
Right.
in our religion, and that's what you need to aspire to. That's what you need to
Right.
focus on.
Yeah, to be the athlete of Christ in this, and to fight with the faith that you know that God is on your side, and that even though the odds are against you, you may win in this.
And she points out that is what happened. Essentially, the story of Jesus.
Yeah, yeah,
Rome is the favorite in that deal, no question
Mhm.
about it.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, this does go back to Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate model there. Um, but it was a way you can't get around the fact that there was some social manipulation that was going on in this. Um, and even more so as the centuries progress. Uh, but in terms of persecutions, I think, as I've already said, that the real persecutions don't happen until after about 250. And the reason they do is because, Rome is starting to fall apart in a lot of ways by the middle of the third century. And the emperors are trying to find a way to uh, allow everybody, uh, to bring everybody together. This wasn't helped very much in 212 when I can't remember the Roman emperor, but he gave everybody Roman citizenship, right? Everybody's Roman citizenship. Kind of an interesting take on what could happen here in the United States today. Rome wasn't trying to deport everybody. Let's give them all Roman citizenship. But in order to do that, you're going to have to give them some guidelines on what it means to be a Roman. And the number one guideline was to, worship the Roman gods, give tribute to the Roman gods. Uh, and, so in 212, when everybody becomes a citizen, by 250, when Decius is the emperor, it's kind of a mess. And he says, this is how we do it. We have to unify everybody, and we have to give them some civic understanding of who they are. And the way we do that is we get them to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Um, and those who do not are obviously seen as the enemies of Rome. And they're the ones who are causing the gods to turn their back on Rome. This is why everything's falling to pieces. And so this is the context in which Christians are refusing to worship. Now, it's not all Christians, because there were obviously some who had become integrated into the Roman Empire. They were, Christians who were serving as priests, for Rome. And so, as Frederickson points out, they had obviously constructed a Christianity that allowed them to do that. And never again would that ever happen after this in the world, ever. No one would ever construct a Christianity which would allow you to be faithful to Christ, but also sacrifice for the government. I'm being entirely facetious because this is exactly what we've got here, in the United States with Christian nationalism. There were obviously some, according to Fredrickson, there were some Christian constructions of Christianity that allowed people to hold these two things in balance. And thus they could sacrifice to the Roman gods, and they would receive what would be called a libellus, which is basically a certificate that said, you're cool, you're a good Roman, and we can trust you. This would be very similar to our green card or our papers or whatever, our citizenship papers, but they were seen as legit. But there were some people who said, absolutely not, we're not going to do this. We're as the Jews say, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. There's only one God. We don't want to be sacrificing to Romans. And they were the ones that had the attention drawn to themselves. But again, by 300 or so, Christianity is not illegal. Christianity is not an underground, according to Fredrickson. It's not an underground movement. It's out in the open. There are Christianities out in the open that are, working hand in hand with the emperor. 250 is when things really start to, fall apart because of the Roman emperor who wants to unify the empire under, a common civic religion. And so then the question becomes, okay, what should we do? Should we resist or should we comply? And there were some who resisted, and there were some who were, very compliant. One of the ways they were compliant was that they would hand over their, and this would be during the time of Diocletian, actually, and from the time of Decius, the Valerian through Diocletian, 250 to 300 or so, they would hand over their sacred texts. The Roman magistrates of the Roman army would come and say, give us your texts. And some in the church said, absolutely not. You're not taking our books away from us. That you're not, these are our sacred texts. Others have said, sure, here you go. Those who gave away their texts were referred to as traditori, I guess. And I don't think she ever defines what that word is, so I had to look it up. Traditor, basically a traitor, right? It looks like traitor. But there were others who, chose not to do this. Now, eventually, it would come to be an issue when Christianity was no longer under the guise of a bad emperor and under Constantine, right? People would look back and say, oh, I remember kind of the way we do with the Civil War, right? I remember your family. They were part of the church. They were part of that group that handed over some of their documents to the Romans. And then there comes to be this suspicion within the church of who is lapsed and who is not. This is the result of, there were some people who were starting their own churches saying, we can't be part of this group that, are lapsed, and we're going to be the true Christians over here. Well, there was a bishop by the name of Cyprian, who in the midst of all this, around 250 of the Common Era, who was one who kind of ran off and, took care of his church from a distance until it was safe to return. He gives this dictate that says extra, and this is going to be historically relevant for centuries afterwards, but extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. And so the loose structure of bishops of the so-called Orthodox Church that was in place at that time prevailed in this. And then the people who were outside, who saw themselves as not lapsed, who saw themselves as very pure, they there's a schism that starts to happen. And that's going to, create some problems on down the line with there's a heresy called the Donatist controversy, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the sacraments were essential in this. Eating and being baptized were the two marks of the church. The people who did not lapse were saying that if you wanted to be a part of the church that handed over their documents, and if you wanted to leave that church and come to our church, you had to be rebaptized. Yeah. So there's a lot of tension that's going on in the church at this point, and it all centers around this idea: how do we relate to Rome? Are we completely contrary to what it means to be civically involved and to be an upright Roman citizen, or can we compromise in this? And as you know, the compromisers are the ones that are going to win out. But there will always be those throughout Christian history are going to, fall on the no compromise side, regardless of, what the issue is. So, any questions about that? Okay.
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead.
just an aside, I'm really impressed and appreciate what Frederickson has done to point out the power and influence exerted by the early Christianities in North Africa,
Yeah,
and how quickly, by the 7th century, how quickly they simply either eradicated or disappeared or converted to Islam.
right.
That I had never quite thought about that. Cleopatra, when Zora Hurston is discussing her, also kind of brings us to the fore again.
Hmm. Interesting. That's right. Because it would be, well, all the way up into Palestine as well, because and into present day Turkey, that's where the 7th and 8th century uh, Muslim expansion, where that took place. But at the same time, remember, Muslims allowed Christians to continue in their worship. But it is interesting that in the early church, there are several North African, Tertullian is, and as is Augustine, uh, some pretty central thinkers. And you don't think of North Africa as a place where, Christianity has a foothold today. So,
And also, it sounds like, appears, that was where, because of geography, maybe, much of the opposition to the centralization of the Church of Rome
mhm.
was appearing.
Right, right. Rome, where Jesus never visited, the becomes the seat of the church. That's right. Um, but what we do see starting to happen around the times of these, persecutions is a kind of a circling of the wagons and people trying to decide, who the real Christians are and who the real Christians are not. And the ones who are not, once Constantine becomes the emperor, they're going to be the ones who are going to be experiencing persecution. So, but I haven't gotten to that point yet. So, by 284 to 305, there's an emperor by the name of Diocletian who wants to continue Decius's unifying civic religio, right? And it's under Diocletian that the greatest persecutions really take place, but not so much with what Frederickson refers to as the domestic Christians, but mostly with the Manichaeans, because Diocletian saw the Manichaeans as real outsiders, as having, been influenced too much by the Persians. So the real persecutions at the beginning of Diocletian's reign really are of the Manichaean Christians. And you might remember that Manichaeism is heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, this idea that there's, dark power in the world and there's a light power and they're fighting it out. And there tends to be a suspicion of the material world as the realm of darkness. And it was those Christians who were heavily persecuted under Diocletian. But the great persecution, as it's often referred to, uh, begins around 303. And it's not going to, remember, Constantine is going to become emperor in 306. So the great persecution under Diocletian, 303 to 306, not really, that long. But the one thing I wanted to point out, and Fredrickson just mentions this very briefly, is that Diocletian, because the empire was becoming so diverse, uh, that Latin in the West was starting to become the language of commerce, the lingua franca, but Greek in the East was still being spoken. Diocletian, well, actually, this is Decius before him, I believe. I don't think it was Diocletian. It was Decius who did this. Now I can't remember. But anyway, I'm sorry. But at one point, it was either Decius or Diocletian. They established an empire governance called a tetrarchy, where there would be two leaders in the West and two in the East. There would be what was referred to as an Augusta, an Augusto, Augusti, and an emperor in the West, two of those in the West and two of those in the East. This has important consequences for the church because what happens is that the churches in both of those realms, the East and the West, develop in their own ways. The ones in the West develop very in close proximity with, the Roman Empire. The ones in the East tended to be far more theologically focused. To the point that today, this is the source of I shouldn't say far more theologically focused. Those in the West are very focused on what's called voluntarism, how to act in the world, right? Those in the East are more speculative and introspective. So eventually what's going to happen is that the Eastern Orthodox Church is going to grow out of this separation. And the Western or Roman Catholic Church is going to grow out of, this geographical and political organization under, darn, I get Decius and Diocletian mixed up. I think it was Decius who broke them up, but if so, then my slide is incorrect. But all of this to say that the persecution that happened under Diocletian was all a matter of trying to maintain a preservation of the Roman religion. For the most part, Christians weren't being persecuted for their beliefs in their gods. They were being persecuted because they were seen as deviant pagans. That's the main point here. They were not doing their duty in maintaining and keeping the unity and thus the empire in the good graces of the gods, and thus were seen as a threat. So comments about this? You know that in 306, Constantine becomes emperor. At least he becomes the presider over the western part of the Roman Empire. And he is very quickly establishes a new kind of piety. Those who were in the persecution seat now become those who are in the seat of favor. Christianity. But remember, there are many Christianities. So just like Decius and Valerian and Diocletian before him, Constantine puts in place a kind of a unification to make sure that the official religion of the state is a completely unified religion. And this is where all of the councils come in, the Council of Nicaea, for example, and then later Constantinopolitan councils and trying to establish the theology of who God is, who Christ is, and who the Holy Spirit is, and what the church is. And it was the result of Constantine's, becoming emperor that we have the creeds that we speak, most specifically the Nicene Creed. But with a new piety also comes a suppression of heresies. And now those who had been persecuted before become the persecutors. And as would happen nearly every century, every subsequent century right up to the very present, those who were persecuted at one time now become the persecutors. For 50 years, that controversy over who was lapsed and who wasn't continues until it gets into the hands of Constantine. And so Constantine brings these Christians together and hears about their understanding of, who the true believers were. Were they the ones who were complicit with Rome, were compliant, handed over their sacred texts, or were they the ones who, saw themselves as removed from Rome and were not going to be complicit at all? Well, in that situation, guess who's going to win? Guess who's going to win? It's going to be those under from Constantine's perspective, these are good Christians, right? They're compliant with the empire. But there remains after this for another 100 years a division within the church. And there were those who would say only those who were truly pure, who did not hand over their documents, that did not cavort with Rome, they are the true church. And so much so that those who are in the, Constantinian church, when they give the sacraments, because of their lapsed state, the sacraments are ineffective. When they when they baptize people, that baptism is ineffective. And this came to be known as the Donatist controversy, that in order to be a priest, you had to have, a perfect character. And that was one of the first heresies that was, thrown out the door. And we'd like to think it was along good theological lines. Well, every person has to recognize their own depravity, right? Or, how they've fallen short. It wasn't that. It was just a matter of, the winners in the group, the winners among the Christians were allied with Constantine. It was the best place to be. I've got any questions? I got about 10 minutes. I wanted to talk a little bit more about, what's happening with the martyrs. Any comments?
Dan,
Yeah,
real
go ahead,
quick,
Danny.
where was Constantinople at this time, in terms of, vis-a-vis Rome, in terms of where was the center of gravity, of the early church?
The center of well, it at this time it's really hard to say because they're already by this time they're already starting to become theologically distinct. The West is certainly becoming much more influenced by the Roman Empire, and the East is becoming much more influenced by the early church fathers there. They are the ones who are we remember our study of the Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire is one that is just kind of shaky, that always had a very tenuous hold on the landscape, on the geography, right? And so the church, the Greek-speaking church, is really focusing more on their theological church fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus, for example, Gregory of Nyssa, and all of these people. All of the early church fathers seem to come from that part of the world, right? The theologians in the West are, by the time of Constantine, they're theologizing hand in hand with Constantine himself. the people in the East, not so much. Constantinople, you know, obviously when Constantine becomes emperor, Constantinople does not exist by that name. Eventually by, you know, Constantine, you know, he was emperor for 30 years. He saw how the Greek church was, you know, you needed to come within his orbit. And so what he does, he moves his capital from Rome to Constantinople to try to impress upon the eastern half of the empire uh, the the wisdom of his ways, so to speak. I don't know if that really answers your question, Denny, but there are certainly two distinct types of Christianity that are developing at this time. And one is you know very happy to have Rome in its back or on its side. The other is very happy to continue doing its theology and thinking of itself as somehow uh, uh, separate, you know, from Rome. But you know, the Byzantine Empire is going to grow out of that. It's eventually Constantinople is going to become the cultural center of the church for the next 400 years, you know, um, or until guess I bet, or until of course Constantinople falls to the Muslims. Um, anyway,
Thanks.
yeah, does that answer your probably a bad answer to your question?
No, it's a Latin Greek split.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know how language create it has its own metaphysics associated with it. And as someone who's studied both Latin and Greek, Latin is the most difficult language I've ever tried. It's, you know, it's just has all these cases that you have to remember. Um, but Greek, there's something about Greek, and I think it's maybe, you know, this German heritage that I have. Greek and German almost they go hand in hand. You know, they're very, I learned Greek first and then I learned to read German after that. And I thought, oh wow, the cases are still the same and a lot of the words are similar. And um, but the metaphysics of the Greek language, the the way the language gives us a paradigm for understanding the world is very different from the metaphysics that is inherent in Latin. Latin is all about, I mean, if I could oversimplify it, Latin is very left brain and Greek is very right brain, the way I look at it, you know. Um, and I think it's been to the detriment of the church that that split ever happened in the first place, because much of the left-brained aspect of the Western church will inevitably develop into the kind of fundamentalism that we see and have seen throughout the centuries, but the kind of fundamentalism that really, uh, you know, we've seen develop over in the last 2 centuries, you know. Uh, they're, they're not, to my knowledge, they're not Greek Orthodox fundamentalists who rise to the type of enthusiasm that the Western evangelical fundamentalists do. So um, that was a little rabbit hole I just went into right there. I'm sorry about that. But you know, it is really interesting the way that government and infrastructure results in something that is going to be historically profound, you know, the East versus the West Church, all as a means of trying to organize a Roman Empire that was starting to become too complex, too top heavy, starting to fall apart. Well, let's divide it into East and West. Well, what has happened is that in a very, very general way, the church has been divided into East and West for, you know, 1800 years after that. So, well, I will not get into the communion of the saints, but this is the place that I found that I was most fascinated by, but we'll do that when we come back next time. Um, Anybody want the last word? Any
Yeah,
ideas?
Dan, I just
Go ahead,
wanted to
Mac.
mention, I just wanted to mention something. To me, it seems like we kind of gloss over the fact of what Emperor Constantine did here. He became emperor in 306, as you point out,
Yep,
but but I think it was in 324. So we have almost another 20 years
yeah,
of the same thing. But then he establishes God and his son are now the only true deity. Well, not only does it do that, but it just cans centuries of Roman religious history. It's
yeah,
gone. It's gone. And what
yeah,
do you think the people, you know, the everyday Joe in Rome at that point, what must they think
right,
when their entire history of all of the pagan gods, Roman gods, whatever you want to call, it's just gone.
right.
We just, as emperor, I hereby replace them.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, that's something that's even beyond Trump's wildest dreams.
Yeah, yeah, which is the act of a god himself, right? But see,
Well, and that's the thing. He demotes his ancestors or his predecessors. You
right.
know, Octavius was a god. Well, not anymore.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, you can't worship him anymore because you can only worship the Christian God and his son.
right.
To me, it's just a revolutionary. The
Well,
enormity of it, I think, is she kind of just skips right over.
right, right. Well, maybe she'll pick it up in,
And then
later
maybe another, that's
chapters.
probably a whole different book, but
Yeah.
I
I
think,
did find this chapter, she skips around and kind of comes back to things that she's already talked about. Um, but you're absolutely right about that. And the received tradition is that by this time there were so many, this is the Christian story, right? There were so many Christians that they just very happily just followed Constantine. And yeah, and go ahead. I want to hear your reaction.
yeah, I don't buy that. I don't
Right.
see how that could possibly be true.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's the received tradition, right? That Constantine was very bright and he started to see that the masses themselves were starting to follow the Christian tradition. And therefore, as a matter of, political strategy, he decided to, make the empire uh, Christian. That this is Harvey used the word propaganda, right? This is the propaganda side of it. But Frederickson's pointing out, no, it was far, far more complex than that. There wasn't a Christian to convert everybody to. That had to come after the fact. That's when all these but your point is very well taken, right? How do you change a paradigm? Your religious paradigm gives you a metaphysical understanding of how the world works. There are gods out there. How do you take that pair of glasses that people are wearing and in a matter of 10 years say, you need to wear these glasses now? And you need to understand that all those gods that you see were a matter of the problem with the lenses you were wearing. And now the lens you need to wear needs to focus on this one God who has a son, Jesus, and then all of the Christian dogma that follows after that. Yeah, and this is why I put this photograph up here, and then I'll let you go. But I think this statue, this is in England someplace, but I don't know where. But it's Constantine. But the reason I like it is because he's holding that sword, which is cruciform, and he's kind of reflecting. You see him kind of in this state of reflection on just what this sword is able to do. And the person, and if you saw the whole thing, he's got his other arm kind of sticking out, and just kind of this lounging way. Uh, I'll put another picture of it up for next time. But but the artist who put the sculptor who put this together really had a good informed historical sense because it's doing exactly what you're saying, Mac. It's Constantine reflecting on a complete paradigm shift that puts Trump to shame, right? So, all right. I'm sorry I've kept you so long. Good conversation, though. Thank you. We'll see you next time, and we'll end up just in the last 3 pages of chapter 3. And then we'll start on chapter 4, which is, I can't remember what chapter 4 is. Chapter 4 begins on page 90, but I can't remember what the topic is. Oh yeah, apocalypticism. Got that to deal with. So, all right, everybody. See you later.